Everyone knows the classic American story of the bad guy who finally gets what's coming to him. But this story is different. This is the story of a man who built an empire in the shadows of New York and beyond. A man who controlled unions, casinos, and an army of loyal soldiers, yet walked the streets of America like any other citizen. No Hollywood script, no courtroom confession. For years, the United States government, with all its power, its agents, its resources, couldn't put him away the way they wanted. Tonight, we're diving into the life of Frank Costello, the mob boss they called the Prime Minister of the Underworld. The man America couldn't seem to arrest, at least not for what they believed he really did. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll see how one of the most powerful mafia bosses in American history operated in plain sight. And why, despite decades of investigation, the system struggled to truly bring him down. If you're into deep dive true crime stories, American history, and the hidden power players behind the scenes, hit that like button, subscribe, and let's get into it. Frank Costello wasn't born into power. He was born Francesco Castiglia in 1891, in a small town in Italy. His family immigrated to the United States when he was still a child, landing in New York City's East Harlem. Like a lot of kids in tough neighborhoods, he got pulled into street life early. By his teens, he was running with local gangs, learning how things really worked, who controlled which corners, which cops looked the other way, and how fear could be turned into a business tool. But here's where Costello was different. Most street kids settled for quick scores. Frank was already thinking like a businessman. He understood that real power wasn't just about money. It was about influence, who you could call, who owed you favors, who you could protect, or pressure. By the 1920s, as Prohibition kicked in, Costello had moved from petty crime into organized bootlegging. He formed partnerships, created distribution networks, and crucially, started building relationships with politicians and law enforcement. While other gangsters carried machine guns, Costello preferred to carry something else: connections. One of his most important moves was aligning himself with another future mob legend, Lucky Luciano. Together, they were part of the new wave of organized crime figures who wanted to run the underworld like a modern corporation, less about family feuds, more about efficiency and profit. And this is where Frank began to step into his true identity. Not just a gangster, but a behind-the-scenes power broker. Frank Costello wasn't born into power. He was born Francesco Castiglia in 1891, in a small town in Italy. His family immigrated to the United States when he was still a child, landing in New York City's East Harlem. Like a lot of kids in tough neighborhoods, he got pulled into street life early. By his teens, he was running with local gangs, learning how things really worked, who controlled which corners, which cops looked the other way, and how fear could be turned into a business tool. But here's where Costello was different. Most street kids settled for quick scores. Frank was already thinking like a businessman. He understood that real power wasn't just about money. It was about influence, who you could call, who owed you favors, who you could protect, or pressure. By the 1920s, as Prohibition kicked in, Costello had moved from petty crime into organized bootlegging. He formed partnerships, created distribution networks, and crucially, started building relationships with politicians and law enforcement. While other gangsters carried machine guns, Costello preferred to carry something else: connections. One of his most important moves was aligning himself with another future mob legend, Lucky Luciano. Together, they were part of the new wave of organized crime figures who wanted to run the underworld like a modern corporation, less about family feuds, more about efficiency and profit. And this is where Frank began to step into his true identity, not just a gangster, but a behind-the-scenes power broker. Crime wasn't just a local issue anymore. Organized crime had become a national concern, crossing state lines, infiltrating unions, businesses, and politics. In 1950, The U.S. Senate launched a major investigation into organized crime, led by Senator Estes Kefauver. These became known as the Kefauver Hearings. For the first time, average Americans watching at home could see and hear alleged mob bosses testify on live television. And in the middle of this spectacle was Frank Costello. Now, this is where the untouchable image becomes really clear. When Costello was called to testify, his lawyers fought hard to control the optics. They negotiated that only his hands would be shown on TV, not his face. So across America, viewers saw something strange, a pair of hands gripping the edge of a table, a calm voice answering certain questions, refusing others. It was unsettling, almost symbolic, the idea of a hidden power whose face you couldn't see. During the hearings, Costello denied being a crime boss. He portrayed himself as a businessman, a gambler, a man who just knew a lot of people. He was pressed about his income, about political connections, about how he gained his influence. At one point, when asked what he had done for his country, he famously replied, something along the lines of paying his taxes and being a good citizen. To some viewers, he seemed slippery. To others, oddly composed. But here's the key: the hearings made him famous, yet didn't immediately put him behind bars for the kind of major organized crime the public imagined. The government had suspicion, testimony, headlines. What they didn't have was the kind of rock-solid, direct evidence juries demand in serious criminal trials. Costello became a symbol of a larger frustration. How do you hold accountable someone who rarely, if ever, leaves fingerprints on the actual crimes? So let's talk about why Frank Costello was so hard to arrest and convict for what authorities believed he really did. In the United States, the system is built around a core idea: you are innocent until proven guilty. And proven doesn't mean we're pretty sure. It means beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. Emotion, rumors, even public opinion, none of that is enough. Organized crime leaders, over time, figured this out. They adapted. He kept distance from direct crime. Authorities believed Costello was a major power in the underworld, but he was careful about not personally carrying out violent acts. Others, lower in the chain, often took those risks. This made it much harder to directly tie him to specific offenses. He used legitimate fronts. Costello was associated with legal businesses and partnerships. When money moved through legal structures, it blurred the line between clean and dirty income. Proving which dollars came from what specific activity was a challenge. He invested heavily in influence. Political contacts, union influence, and social connections created a kind of shield. This didn't make him above the law, but it did mean that investigations took longer and required more careful work. He was disciplined in public. Unlike some other figures, he wasn't constantly in bar fights, public shootouts, or flashy incidents. He kept a relatively controlled profile. Law enforcement at the time didn't have some of the tools that would later become crucial in fighting organized crime. Like modern surveillance technology, advanced financial tracking, or powerful statutes such as the RICO Act, which would come much later. So, while the government could suspect Costello of being a top organized crime figure, turning that into a clean, watertight, courtroom-ready case was another story. They did manage to hit him with some charges over the years, especially around things like tax evasion and contempt of court. But these weren't the massive. Being hard to arrest doesn't mean you're safe. Inside the world of organized crime, power shifts are constant, and enemies don't always file legal paperwork. In 1957, as rival factions within organized crime pushed for control, Frank Costello's life nearly ended. One night, as he returned to his apartment building in Manhattan, a gunman waited for him in a hallway. The attacker fired, and Costello was shot in the head. He survived, incredibly, because the bullet only grazed his skull. But the message was clear: his time at the top was being challenged. Many accounts and later investigations linked this attempted hit to fellow mob figure Vito Genovese, who allegedly wanted to fully take over the organization. After the attack, Costello did something unexpected for a man long associated with power. He stepped back. He reportedly told others he was retiring from active leadership in organized crime. Whether that retirement was absolute or partial is debated, but it marked the end of his era as a dominant, frontline power player. At the same time, law enforcement wasn't letting go. Costello was prosecuted for tax-related charges and spent some time in prison, though not for the sweeping organized crime activities associated with his name. In other words, they could wound him, they could pressure him, but they never pinned the kind of grand, cinematic criminal case on him that the public might imagine when they hear the words mafia boss. He lived out his later years under surveillance, suspicion, and shifting influence, but still very much alive and, compared to many of his peers, surprisingly intact. Frank Costello died in 1973, in New York City, reportedly from a heart attack, not in a hail of bullets, not in a prison cell serving a life sentence. For a man painted as one of the most powerful crime bosses in America, that ending is almost shocking in its normality. No matter how you feel about him, his story raises some fascinating questions. How can someone suspected of such deep involvement in organized crime manage to avoid the kind of convictions we'd expect? What does it say about the balance between civil liberties and law enforcement power in the United States? And what happens when a criminal figure chooses influence over notoriety, preferring a handshake with a politician over a headline in the paper? Costello's life became a kind of blueprint for the white-collar gangster image, well-dressed, soft-spoken, working through intermediaries and systems instead of brute force on the streets. Some people see him as the symbol of everything frustrating about trying to fight organized crime, a man they feel the system never fully held accountable. Others see his story as proof that in the United States, even the most suspected figures still have to be proven guilty with real evidence, not just stories and accusations. Either way, Frank Costello sits in a strange place in American history, both a powerful underworld figure and a man the government never truly nailed for the full extent of what they believed he did. When you peel back the layers of Frank Costello's story, you're not just looking at one man, you're looking at the structure of American power itself. His life highlights the limits of law enforcement in complex, hidden criminal networks, the importance of rules of evidence and due process, even when the public is convinced someone is guilty, and the ways money and influence can shape who gets investigated, and how, in some ways, Costello's story feels like a battle between two versions of America. On one side, the underworld, private deals, secret meetings, quiet favors. On the other, the official system, courts, laws, hearings broadcast on national television. And in the middle of all that, a man who somehow navigated both worlds. The phrase "the untouchable mafia boss America couldn't arrest" isn't about someone literally above the law. It's about how incredibly difficult it can be to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, what someone did, when they've spent their entire life making sure they never leave clear, direct evidence behind. It also reminds us that history isn't just shaped by the loudest, most violent figures sometimes. It's shaped by the quiet man in the tailored suit, sitting calmly at a Senate hearing, with only his hands visible on national TV. So, what do you think? Was Frank Costello a criminal mastermind who slipped through the cracks of the system, or a symbol of how carefully the American justice system has to move, even with people it strongly suspects? Did the government fail, or did the rules of evidence and due process work exactly as designed, protecting everyone from being convicted on reputation alone? Let me know your take in the comments. Do you think there could ever be someone like Frank Costello in today's world of cell phones, digital trails, and surveillance? Or has technology made it nearly impossible to operate that far in the shadows? If you watched all the way to the end, you're exactly the kind of person I make these deep dive stories for. Hit the like button, it helps a lot with the algorithm. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode in this series on real-life power players of the American underworld. In the next video, we're looking at another figure who tried to rewrite the rules of organized crime in the United States. But this time, the government did find a way to hit back hard. Thanks for watching, and remember, in history, just like in real life, the most dangerous people aren't always the ones making the most noise.